Former African heads of state will launch a historic initiative to tackle the continent's debt crisis. The launch tomorrow will take place on the sidelines of the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors meeting. The former presidents will sign the Cape Town Declaration, described as a decisive call for urgent debt relief and fairer borrowing terms for African countries. The 8 former heads of state who will be meeting in Cape Town for this historic initiative include former Presidents Thabo Mbeki, Olusegun Obasanjo of Nigeria and Joyce Banda of Malawi, among others. The issue of the debt and how it affects countries in the African continent features strongly during the deliberations in this meeting. South Africa's budget, that was supposed to be tabled in Parliament last week, allocated at least 424.2 billion rand to service debt costs. We're joined now to expand the conversation by Director of UJ Centre for Social Change and Political Economist, Patrick Bond. Very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. I mean, with South Africa's G20 presidency placing debt sustainability, debt relief at the heart of the global economic agenda, as these former heads of states come together to share ideas, what makes it so historic?
Well, I think the most important thing is that the G20 has been, in the past, responsible for global financial stability. When they began in the late 1990s, just as finance ministers, and in 2008, when they came together as heads of state because of the world financial crisis, and then in 2020 with COVID. In these 3 instances, they authorized all sorts of techniques, the last 2 quantitative easing, which is printing money to bail out particularly their own banks. And now, especially after the 2022 debt relief, which was a very mild, let's say, postponement rather than actually writing down debt, the G20 is faced with a really crucial matter, which is many African countries really are unable to pay, and 3 very strong African economies actually suffered bankruptcy, those being Ghana and Zambia and Ethiopia. And the reason was simple. The debt burden, the hard currency debt, some of them actually issuing euro bonds, so Europeans took on the loans, became more expensive after the interest rates from 2022 went through the roof. And they've only started to come down, but it's been too late, and most African countries, including our own, have a great deal of trouble in repaying.
And what approach do you think these discussions should take as the former heads of states come up with some solutions and, of course, point out some of the challenges?
Well, there are 2 big problems. The interest rate still isn't low enough, and it did come down. But as you know, from our own balance sheets and our own households and companies and our own government, even in South Africa, the strongest economy in some ways, we still haven't seen the lowering. And the dilemma is you've got a central bank president whose name is Jerome Powell from the United States. He's really the most crucial central banker. And he was the one who put up the interest rates after inflation surged in the US in 2022. And that was what really caused so many African countries to suffer debt distress. Now, the dilemma for him is that he doesn't want to put the interest rates down for a simple reason. His boss, Donald Trump, is now putting up the tariffs, meaning the goods that are coming into the U.S. will have an extra price because Trump wants to punish his enemies, including South Africa. And that means inflation may be a big problem. He's warned that, which means he doesn't want to put the interest rates lower. He might have to put them higher to deal with inflation, which means more pressure on African countries. And I think that would be maybe the single most crucial market-related mechanism, which is a reasonable interest rate, to have all interest rates around the world lowered. The other would be to do the debt audits, which the Kenyans, Gen Z, you might recall last June, they demanded and they protested and they won a debt audit for Kenya. They haven't gone through it all the way yet, but it's that sort of, let's say, questioning how much of the debt is really reasonable to repay. And if we look at our own, about $165 billion in foreign debt, I think quite a bit of it would be declared odious or not really the responsibility of ordinary people to pay. Lots of debt for corrupt purposes. Those loans to Eskom and to Transnet are very obviously odious. They shouldn't have been made by banks like the World Bank or the China Development Bank, the two biggest lenders, because the proceeds were based on a corrupt set of relationships in Eskom and Transnet. I think that exists across the African continent. So debt audits are what some of the citizenries are demanding, and I hope the G20 will take that into consideration and actually say, well, some of this debt really you don't owe after all.
Yeah. With the global trade tensions taking place and, of course, all that's happening around US President Donald Trump and South Africa, what opportunity do you think this meeting will present for the leaders of the African continent?
Well, they should, because the AU is an official member as of 2023. It should allow Africans to say, if you actually are cutting USAID, although there was a court judgment yesterday that may reverse that, but if you're cutting some of our foreign exchange inflows that are used for aid, and now you're probably going to cut the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. It means that many African exporting countries, South Africa again exemplary, won't have the forex, that foreign exchange required to repay hard currency loans. So maybe converting some of them to local currency loans, maybe again after a debt audit questioning whether they should have been made. And then, to be frank, there have been so many instances where simply the power of printing either dollars or euros or British pounds or Japanese yen, the four big currencies of the G20, when you just print those as part of your quantitative easing. But Africa doesn't get very much, or often nothing. It's only rich people and the banks that get bailed out. Inequality has soared since the asset inflation associated with quantitative easing. So it does strike me that, if there were any justice, let's take the three words from South Africa's hosting. Yep. Those are solidarity, equality, and sustainability. And if you apply that to debt, much deeper write-downs really would be more appropriate. However, we're in a period where we've got presidents like Donald Trump who don't really seem to care much about Africans. So you may have to go to a G19, toss the US out, and really do it properly.
Yeah. South Africa's budget that was meant to be tabled in Parliament last week allocated at least 424.2 billion rand just to service debt costs. I mean, what does that tell us, and the perhaps significance of such a meeting?
Well, I think it shows that South Africa and many countries, not just African, we are suffering from, in our case, an international monetary fund austerity regime. The total cuts from 2020 to 2026 are 18.1% per person over this 6 years. That's the deepest austerity. And it does mean you're cutting not just the fat, but deep into the bone, into the marrow. And the result, if you have to raise the value-added tax, you get revolts. Kenya's Gen Z, Nigeria's Days of Rage, the Mozambicans protesting, they've all been in a way related very much to whether this international monetary fund's squeezing so that you just pay debt, and then very little left for ordinary people. And I think it does reach a point where you start to get riots and protests and the sorts of demands that we get out of the international financial system as currently constituted. Get some deep reforms, maybe de-dollarize. And as the Germans are thinking about a NATO without the United States, if you have a Donald Trump that is as brutal, well, maybe we have to go it alone without the United States as an AGOA partner and a lender and an aid provider, and bite the bullet now for more prosperity down the road.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for weighing in on this discussion, leaving it there with Director of the UJ Centre for Social Change and political economist Patrick Bond.